Greetings, fellow Bible readers. Welcome to week 31 of our Bible read-through. This week, as we continue our way through the book of Isaiah, we're going to notice a pretty significant shift in tone and tenor of the book. We're going to see a greater emphasis on God's gospel promises to people. Not that they hadn't been present earlier in the book, but they get a greater emphasis starting with chapter 40. So without further ado, let's get down to the details for each day. On day 1, as we look at chapters 38 through 40, we're going to see that shift in emphasis. And in fact, it's such a striking shift in tone that some critics of the Bible have suggested that Isaiah chapters 40 through 66, kind of the second half of the book, was written by a different person. However, that really is a poor concept to operate with, because even though there's a big shift in tone, there's some very strong ties in subject matter and content. You can see that especially as you think about chapters 38 and 39 and chapter 40. Chapter 40 emphasizes God's faithfulness to his word. And in the historical chapters that were just before it, not just 38 and 39, but even going back into like 36, we see again and again incidents from the ministry of Isaiah where God showed his faithfulness to his words and promises. So ties those two halves of the book together, despite the shift in emphasis and tone. Then on day 2, as we look at chapters 41 and 42, we begin to see God set up a contrast between himself and idols. We see God point out the folly of worshiping idols, because idols have no knowledge. They don't know what happened in the past. They can't tell what's going to happen in the future. In contrast, God talks about how he knows both past and future and has plans to send his servant to rescue his people. And that's another feature that's pretty significant in the next several chapters of Isaiah, is what are called the servant songs, where God, through Isaiah, speaks about this servant of the Lord who's going to come and rescue his people. And really, these servant songs give a picture of the Savior Jesus. Then on day 3, as we look at chapters 43 and 44, God continues to build on this comparison with idols by emphasizing the issue of power. God points out how he is going to work a rescue for his people that will be greater than the rescue in the Exodus, where God caused the plagues and parted the sea and destroyed Pharaoh's army. God's going to create an even bigger and more impressive rescue than that. In contrast, the idols are powerless to do anything. Then on day 4, as we look at chapters 45 through 47, we see God use the picture of an earthly king by the name of Cyrus. God predicts that this Cyrus would free his people from their captivity, bring them back to their land, and who would defeat their enemies. And God uses that to help his people understand what his servant, the servant of the Lord, would be like. He would be like Cyrus in that he would spiritually rescue his people from captivity. He would spiritually restore them, and he would spiritually defeat their enemies. Then on day 5, as we look at chapters 48 through 50, we notice in these chapters how God continues to work through his servant. And God especially contrasts the stubbornness and unwillingness of the Israelites with the willing obedience of his servant. And then we get to, really in many ways, kind of the cap of these servant songs with our day 6 reading of chapters 51 through 54. Because in chapter 53, Isaiah really builds everything to this climax, where he spends the whole chapter talking about the servant of the Lord who is going to suffer for the sins of people. And really, Isaiah is presenting to us 700 years before it happened, the suffering and death of Jesus, and he does it in exquisite detail. As you read through Isaiah chapter 53, maybe think in your mind about the events of Jesus' suffering and death, and think through how you can see those events already kind of, in a sense, unfolding before Isaiah's eyes in prophecy. Then finally, on day 7, as we look at chapters 55 through 58, we see how God deals with people. We see him in 55 calling people by his word. We see him, as the chapters go on, that he wants to deal with all people. We see how the Lord is able to protect his people, sparing them from disaster, sometimes by taking them out of this world while preserving the wicked for judgment. And ultimately, as we look at this section, we see God dealing with people in his grace and mercy to draw them to himself. Especially, we see how God dwells and connects to the contrite in heart. That's all for this week. We'll see you next week.